Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Penguin Random House India, I invite you all and welcome you all to this evening's launch of The Unending Game, a former Raw Chief's Insights into Espionage by Vikram Sood. This is a unique book for various reasons. In it, we have a former chief of the Research and Analysis Wing and a career intelligence officer deconstruct the shadowy world of espionage. From the Cold War era to the age of global jihad, from surveillance states to cyber and cyber warfare, from gathering information to turning it into credible intelligence, the Unending Game provides a panoramic view of the rarely understood profession of spying to serve a country's strategic and security interests. For, as a country's stature and reach grow, so do its intelligence needs. This is especially true of a country like India that has ambitions of being a global player, even as it remains embattled in its own neighbourhood. The Unending Game tackles these questions while providing a national and international perspective on external intelligence, its relevance in securing and advancing national interest, and why intelligence is the first playground in the game of nations. Vikram Sood retired in March 2003 after heading the R&AW after 31 years in the organization. He is currently advisor at the Observer Research Foundation and writes regularly on security, foreign relations, and strategic issues. I now call upon Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman, Observer Research Foundation, to please deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you, Swati, for opening this today. Good evening, distinguished guests, or everyone who assembled here for this launch of the book. Honorable Union Minister for Textiles, Smriti Irani ji, Baijayant Panda ji, Mr. Vikram Sood, and of course, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, who should be joining us in about 5 minutes, and Swati, who's done all the hard work putting all this together. Thank you for being here. Thank you especially to the Minister, Baijayant, for taking time off today and joining us this evening for the release. There are, when I was reading this book, the first thing which actually disappointed me was the statement saying that if James Bond were alive today, he would not ever make it to any intelligence agency. Now, frankly, I have been used to this world of fast cars and pretty women and vodka martinis, and that is associated with the world of spies. It's the complete Ian Fleming's world, which he has rubbished in this book. But then the point is, if it's not like James Bond, then the world of espionage, I would still insist, after reading your book, I would still insist, is something like, Mission Impossible. I mean, you can't run away from that. And you have this, if you actually read the book carefully, I'm sure you will not find vestiges of Goldfinger or Casino Royale in it, but you will definitely find, the latest Ethan Nathan's, the entire episodes. For one, dead drops are real, aren't they? Dead drops are not about a loose brick sitting in North Block somewhere or a cutout copy of the Unending Game lying in the ORF library. Dead drops are actually about the world has moved into cyber dead drops, and they're very, very real. And more importantly, as Tom Cruise finds out in every movie, this world is full of rogue agents. The only difference is that in a Mission Impossible movie, it takes 2 hours to discover all the rogue agents and the deep throats. In real life, as Mr. Vikram Sood tells us, it may take years, and sometimes you may never find out about them. So this is the world of espionage. And the perfect spy in the end is not like James Bond or even Ethan Hunt. He's someone like our dear author, who performs the invaluable work assigned to him at great personal risk in a hostile environment and then retires to live a quiet life. And the hostile environments are not necessarily the streets of Karachi. The corridors of North Block are probably even more dangerous to negotiate. But jokes apart, the moment you pick up this book, you can see that unlike many which have in the same genre, this one is not a memoir. No, it is not about the person. It is not about his musings in the afterlife. It is a down-to-earth book about the art and craft of espionage. It examines, as Swati pointed out, the position of intelligence wings in the modern state, looks at their evolution through the Cold War, and then it ventures into the kind of metamorphosis they are undergoing in a very, very different world today. And in a world where often, various non-state and proto-state actors are busy over time and often also stealing the limelight from the stodgy old Westphalian entities owning the so-called intelligence agencies. So this is the new world. And perhaps for many of us, the most alluring sections of the book will be, of course, on India and his takes on the neighborhood. And indeed, he holds you there with his narration, with his deep understanding of ISI and, of course, the R&AW. But beyond these, the Unending Game is really a breathtaking tour de force, exposing us to the wide gamut of organizations. And these are not just about the CIA or the KGB or intelligence agencies. These are about all kinds of other parallel organizations, even think tanks, secret societies, which are all in covert and overt ways part of the game of intelligence gathering. And of course, Vikram's term as head of the research analysis wing between 2000 and 2003 was in fact a time in which India, like the rest of the world, was undergoing some of the major transformations the world of intelligence is seeing. And as some of you would remember, right before he took over, December 1999, was the Indian Airlines flight IC-814 hijack, which gave the country's first taste of the use of media as a weapon in the age of information. Then came 9/11, which completely changed the world. Vikram assures me he's got nothing to do in any of this, even though it all happened under his watch. And not to forget the attack on the Indian Parliament in December 2001. Now, having spent 31 years as a career intelligence officer, so you have been in the vanguard. You've also been at the forefront, adapting the country's intelligence practices to align with these new unfolding dynamics. And you have very solidly written about the constant need to form and reform these agencies. You said the successful spy is one who retires after 30 years to lead a quiet, retired life. But I must say that your life as part and parcel of ORF for the last 12 years has hardly been quiet. Now, you've been regularly contributing, writing in public fora, sharing your views on strategy, on the neighborhood, on things happening around us. And the best part is when I picked up this book, there is no sign anywhere that this is his first full-length literary endeavor. Because, so you take to the form as a fish takes to water. It flows so easily. Each chapter we find is more insightful, peppered with anecdotes, peppered with lots of interesting stories and tales, which completely hold the reader. And there are no good guys and bad guys in this book. So that is the beauty of this book. There are no emotive tales about betrayal and loss of trust or anything of that sort. It's first and last a book about the ethos of statecraft, a dispassionate look at why we are where we are. And it is a tale told very clinically, with a very rare sense of humor and that typical acerbic wit which only Vikram Sood can have. When you talk to him, you immediately see that wit coming out. And that is part of this book. So for anyone who's interested in a kind of crash course in the world of espionage and the deep state, these short 269 pages will really stand out. They will also stand out because this is one of the few Indian voices on a theme largely dominated by Western authors. And so the insights too, whether they are about Osama bin Laden or about 9/11, are refreshingly different. For those who haven't yet read the book, let me tell you that the sheer expanse of the subject covered in this volume holds you from page 1 more than any Tom Cruise movie will, including the latest Skyfall. Or not Skyfall, which is just a Fallout. So do pick up a copy if you haven't already done so, and if Vikram hasn't signed it already, he'll hold back and sign them all for you. So thank you, and join me in congratulating our prima donna of the evening, Mr. Vikram Sood, for this wonderful release.
Thank you very much for your very interesting opening remarks, sir. I now invite Honorable Minister and all our esteemed panelists to please unveil and formally launch the book. I now invite the Honorable Minister, Srimati Smriti Irani ji, to please say something about the book.
He doesn't come with his own background music, and I have never seen Vikram Sood in a tuxedo. But when I asked him, what does an intelligence officer determine about an individual he or she meets? What is the first thing that he or she concludes upon? Mr. Sood said, you're either an asset or a target. Given that most of you have been given tea before the book launch, I can safely say people gathered here today are assets as considered by Vikram Sood. There are many who wondered, what is Smriti Irani doing at Vikram Sood's big book launch? Well, if you ask my colleague and friend Panda, he will tell you we needed a troublemaker and hence called upon the biggest one in Lutyens, Delhi. I've had the privilege of knowing the gentleman for a very long time. And what stands out about his personality is that in a city where everybody who's everybody flaunts contacts, associations, relationships, Vikram Sood never gloats. When I spoke to him about how he came about writing this book, and when I spoke to Penguin about it, I said, do you know that there are many books within this one book? He strips the intelligence community of all the glamour. In one of the rare interviews that he had recently given, a reporter who's seated here today amongst in this hall asked him, what do you think about the female agents? Are they femme fatales? He disapprovingly nodded. He said they're officers, not femme fatales, but we have many male agents, not many female agents. The quintessential gentleman spy. When you look at the book, he talks about the secret societies as has been enunciated by Mr. Joshi. The Bilderberger Gang, the Trilateral Commission. He talks about the Pinay Circle. These are names, associations, most of us have never heard of. He talks about the Internet of Things. He speaks about how not many know that the Internet came to its being because somebody in the US defense system thought about needing an alternate mode of communication. How many of us who are today internet savvy know of that origin? And that is what this book is about. Not about the glamour, but about the academics of the intelligence community. Vikram Sood, in one of his chapters, says, frogs, if thrown into hot water, will jump out immediately. But if the water heats slowly, they get comfortable and do not notice the danger until it's too late. He articulates the danger subtly when he talks about artificial intelligence, when he talks about cybercrime. He talks about it not only an aspect to be aware of, not only an impending danger, but also an aspect where we as Indians can explore many new opportunities. If you look at the Global Cybersecurity Index as published by the UN agency, International Telecommunications Union in July 2017, India ranks 23rd. Today, the cybersecurity business is worth close to over $200 billion, and it's expected to touch over $300 billion. How much of that industry, how much of the community is India a part of, is something Vikram Sood begs you to consider and reflect upon. He talks about the state of surveillance, he talks about deep state, and I told him that because of the academics of this book, you compelled me to go hunting and chance upon something called the IMSI catcher. He asked me, what is the IMSI catcher? And I frowned back because knowing Vikram Sood, he feigns his ignorance when he knows much. But the reason I stand here, ladies and gentlemen, today, celebrating a book, basically academia, is because to sell a book, Vikram Sood did not break his oath of secrecy. I told him that Google finds everybody and everything about everybody. I nudged him and I said, when I Wikipedia'd you, under personal details, they only had nationality Indian. That is all Google knows about him. And that is what I proudly say about him. The gentleman spy that India deserved, got, who served with dignity, who writes with dignity. My best wishes, Mr. Sood, for not only this book, but many more to come.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your comments. I now invite Mr. Sood to say something about the book and the journey of writing this book.
Thank you, Swati. After so much has been said about the book and about me, it is humbling to say anything more, really. I have so many to thank for this book. First of all, let me start by thanking all my distinguished guests here today for taking the trouble of coming here to participate in the book launch. Then I would thank the Minister, Srimati Smriti Irani, for graciously agreeing to come for the book launch, and more for all the kind words she has spoken about the book and about me. I'm truly honored. And to Sanjay Joshi for his comments about my book and about me. Once again, my gracious thanks to you. I am also favored with a distinguished panel. Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, former NSA, is with us. Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, former NSA, is with us. And so is Mr. Baijayant Panda, who is going to be the moderator. One of our panelists has unfortunately not been able to make it today. He has a family indisposition. So Mr. Sanjay Joshi and Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon will be guiding us through the book, helped along by Mr. Panda. Mr. Panda and Mrs. Irani are my two favorite politicians, and I'm so happy to have them here with me today. About the book, I think it has been eloquently expressed by both Srimati Irani and Mr. Sanjay Joshi. I do not wish to add too much and to stand in the way of further discussions on the book, except to say that when I started the book, my idea was to dispel the commonly held perceptions about intelligence and to put it in the correct perspective, bring it into reality. Therefore, I divided the book into 3 parts. First is academics, the second is the practice of the academics, and the third is what next? What is it that our country has to do so that its intelligence continues to be relevant 30, 40 years? Just name a figure, whether it's 30 years or 40 years. I prefer 30 years because that's the lifespan of an intelligence officer, of a normal intelligence officer. So what is the threat perception then? Are we good enough to meet it? If not, what should we do for that? The other aspect was that in this world, the modern day world, opinions are made instantly. It's like the flash of a second. You have social media, you have various kinds of communication channels. So news and intelligence spread very fast. And when news spreads fast, it's not always good news. It's usually bad news that spreads faster. That is going to be the challenge of the future for us in the intelligence. How do you match that? How do you counter that? Countering is easy if you go in for surveillance and all-time, all-purpose surveillance as the Americans are doing. But that's not something we can either afford, nor is the threat perception in our country, I think, of that nature, that we need that all-purpose dome around us all the time. However, so that's how my book is structured. It is not a personal memoir. I am not the message. I am not the subject. It is not meant for professionals and academics alone. It is meant to bring it down for the averagely interested young person who would like to understand and maybe also be a recruit. Always target somebody. I now hand over to Mr. Panda for his comments.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be at this book launch and also to be asked to moderate this discussion. I must say I was particularly looking forward to asking some questions to all the panelists, of course, they're all distinguished, but particularly to my friend Smriti Irani, to which I was told that holding the office that she holds, it might be awkward for her to answer questions which could get the government into trouble. So I was wondering, how is it even possible with Smriti Irani around that I could say anything to provoke any more trouble? But I thought she did a wonderful job of speaking about the book. I was saying that having read the book myself, I was very impressed with her comments on it. She clearly has read the book also herself, and that's saying a lot for... I'll leave it at that. I'm going to keep my initial comments very brief. This is a wonderful book, and I urge everyone here to read it for the following reasons. It is not a breezy memoir. In other words, it's not superficial. It has real depth. It is written by somebody who clearly thinks about the issues and goes into it at some depth. But what it is also not is a dull, plodding book for people in the profession. It is, as was already mentioned, a book for lay people just as much as for people who are familiar with Mr. Sood's line of work. It is peppered with anecdotes and little revelations that make it very interesting without, as Smriti ji said, compromising the oath of secrecy. I think it also provokes real thought and, in some senses, concern. It's also, as I said, peppered by anecdotes and has those little wry one-liners that you might expect from some of the Bond movies that Mr. Joshi was referring to. But it also should be food for thought. It should make us wonder, make us think, and to some degree, make us worry. I think this book will leave you both shaken and stirred. And also, fortunately, a little bit tickled. And that is why this is such a wonderful book worth reading. Now, I'm going to keep my further comments for prodding the panelists as we go along and getting them to address some of the particular aspects covered in the book. But may I, before concluding, request everyone to ensure that their phones are either on silent or turned off so that we can have an uninterrupted discussion. Shall we go straight to the former NSA to begin with his comments and proceed with the discussion thereafter?
Well, frankly, I think what has to be said about the book has been said already. That it's not a memoir, that it's not... I found it very reassuring, actually. I wasn't shaken. For one thing, it made it clear that James Bond would never make it in R&AW because he's not intelligent enough, he's doing all the wrong things, chasing women, etc. And that we have had people in charge of R&AW who knew what they were doing, who had thought through their job. And for me, therefore, this was really a wonderful book because it shows that Vikram Sood not only knew his trade craft, but knew his craft, had thought through what intelligence is all about. And that really says something because, and the best part of it is that he lets you think that he hasn't done it. I mean, I've known him since, college? Yeah, you were 16 years old? And I never knew he could write so well. Now that shows what a really good intelligence person can do. You think you know him, you think you know all about him, but the best part of the book for me really is that it gives you a view of intelligence that is Indian. And that also from an Indian point of view tells you how to start thinking about issues. You know, many of the stories are in the public domain. In fact, it's remarkable. He has not divulged any official secrets, all of which are safely locked up in his head. Not one. His oath of secrecy is absolutely sacrosanct. And yet, when he describes events which we all know about, we've all read in the papers, once he tells it to you, you suddenly see, oh, there's more to this than I thought. And that's why I would recommend this book to you, because it teaches you a way of seeing things, a way of looking at things, of how an intelligence officer looks at the world, deals with it, operates in it. And therefore, no matter how much we tell you about the book, please go and buy it and read it. It's well worth reading. Because he covers such a range of subjects: the rise of the surveillance state, the use of technology, cybersecurity, of course, the messiness of reality, of how hard it is for an intelligence officer to actually work in the real world. And for me, the best bits really were the sections, the beginning, the tradecraft, and then the whole future and all the challenges that we face. And yes, that is daunting, it is worrying, but it also opens up huge opportunities. Many of these, whether it's cyber, many of these are areas which are new not just to us, but to everybody else. So there is an opportunity for us to actually go out there and make our mark. It is also worrying in one sense, because I think he makes it clear from his enumeration of the threats and the future that there is no such thing as 100% absolute security, that there will be threats, that there are things that we will have to deal with. And I would strongly recommend reading his chapter on terrorism and on how we have coped with it, but also on what we should expect in the future. I think that is well worth reading. But even so, if we can show the quality of mind and the degree of knowledge that this book shows on Vikram Sood's part in the future, and that's a big if, by the way, then I think we're safe, and I think we're in good shape. I'll stop here, but for the time being, since we are going to discuss these issues.
May I request former Foreign Secretary Mr. Sibal to make his initial comments?
I read through the book. It covers a very vast canvas because it's not related to Raw's history or Raw's work abroad and achievements of Raw per se. Clearly, he was not in a position to do that because of Official Secrecy Act. But then that sort of leaves you a little dissatisfied because we would have wanted to know much more about Raw itself. As I said, he's covered a very wide canvas because he's talking about the unending game and the insights into espionage. So he talks about the Cold War and the competition between the United States and Russia. The interesting bit is about the competition between these two in India, where the Soviets at one time were dominating the narrative, and how the CIA tried to balance that narrative by developing one of their own, by promoting Quest and Imprint. But then he just leaves it at that. And if you want to then look more into this, then you'll have to look elsewhere. Also, the attempts made to interfere in Indian elections. We talk a lot about these days about Russian interference in US elections and the European elections, to which Vikram refers to in his book. But he does allude to Swamiji and all the activities of Adnan Khashoggi and Larry Colvin, what have you, in terms of trying to help Rajiv Gandhi win the election and try and stymie the election of V.P. Singh. Eventually, of course, they didn't succeed. The other thing which actually we all know, but is worth pointing to, is the CIA's failures in India. And the most significant failures were the inability to penetrate our Atomic Energy Commission and ISRO. And of course, we all know they couldn't detect our activities before we went nuclear in 1998. Other than that, because he belongs to that world, so he talks about the work of an intelligence agent, the whole process of recruitment, and how it is very chancy. It may succeed, it may not succeed. The pitfalls in that, and then how you analyze intelligence, which is very, very difficult. Where you move from information to knowledge to intelligence. These are the three stages. And then, of course, he becomes very contemporary also in terms of dealing with the whole issues of terrorism. That how does any intelligence agency anticipate what we today call lone wolf attacks? Now, he doesn't mention the incidents of people using vehicles to run over people on pavements. Now, if the vans and cars can become vehicles of terrorism and not necessarily Boeing aeroplanes, then the cities, our cities and our civilian population is threatened. And so how does any intelligence agency anticipate this? Fortunately, we've not had such incidents in India, but there is this there is this issue. He also talks about some of our intelligence failures, the Kargil, for example, or the Mumbai attacks in 2002. The other parts which I found rather interesting, but again, it is tantalizing and he doesn't dwell more into that, is the Mitrokin papers. Many of you may have heard about those. And there is a chapter on India and how some of our cabinet ministers during 1971 were passing on information to the CIA, etc., etc. So there is the book covers, as I said, a wide canvas which deals with the operation of international agencies, and there's the international background, including what Shiv Shankar Menon mentioned about the new technologies and how they're complicating the work of the intelligence agencies and Facebook and everything else, and all the social media and the activities of the American corporations and how they are linked with the US intelligence agencies in terms of data collection, data brokering, the activities of the NSA, Phillips with Snowden and Assange and everything else. So there's a very rich mixture of everything for you in this book, and I would recommend also that you buy it and read it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to prod the panelists with 5 questions, one each on each of these following 5 broad categories. First, I'd like to, one category I want to understand is reference to the political leadership's ability to understand realpolitik versus getting lost in idealism. There's a reference to that in the book, which I'll come to. I'm going to ask a question about oversight of intelligence operations. How does it and how should it work in a democracy like India? I can't not ask about the ISI, so I'm going to ask a question on that. I'm also going to ask a question about the criticisms that intelligence agencies face in whether they have provided adequate advance information for catastrophic developments or not. And finally, I'm going to talk about social media, because the spread of the internet, as the book covers quite eloquently, creates vast new threats as well as, I believe, opportunities. So I'm going to come first to the author himself. Now, I'm going to ask you the question about yeah? See, the minute I mention ISI, this gets disrupted. But jokes aside, Mr. Sood, you make a very interesting assertion in that you say that the ISI is part of the system in Pakistan that determines strategy, whereas R&AW in India is a service provider to the government, to those who make policy and determine strategy, and that's a crucial difference. And you make the point that because the Pakistani establishment has the firm, inbuilt, fundamental belief system that India is an enemy, you make quite a strong statement that any peace talks would be futile. Now, this is very much in line with what the current government has been speaking about. Now, I'd like you to share with us, do you think this can ever change? Do you think, considering what ISI is and what Pakistan is, do you think ISI can ever, for example, come under civilian control, as was attempted once or twice but failed? Do you think this paradigm can change?
It's a long answer. Starting with the first thing, can this thing change? The Pakistan attitude towards us, can there be peace? Can we all live happily as neighbors? I think not. In fact, the way Pakistan is configured, the way their state is configured, the way their regimes are configured, which are increasingly affecting the population, I see very little hope that Pakistan's mindset will change in the foreseeable future. So anybody who talks of peace with Pakistan, these are noble thoughts. We should all have them. We also, when we talk of war, when we talk of finding out what the other chap is doing, actually we are not making war. We're trying to find out ways to avoid war, to provide our ministries and our defense forces information so that they can be adequately prepared to handle the situation. It's not that we're going out with jihadi forces trying to disrupt life elsewhere. So, as the way things are, Kashmir is not the issue that will help you solve the problem. It won't. It will continue. Kashmir is now an excuse. It is an excuse for the Pakistan army to remain in control of Pakistan. It is now the largest corporate sector in Pakistan. It owns land, it owns properties, it runs fertilizer factories, it runs bread factories, it runs atta factories, it runs all the industries that matter for the people. And they run the National Logistics Cell, which supplies goods all over the country, including heroin. So we have a country which is a country in name, which is a state in name. And good luck to them. ISI and R&AW, yes, we are totally different. It's apples and oranges. We are a service provider, as I've written. We are a service provider for the NSA's office, for the Foreign Ministry, for the defense, for the armed forces. We don't make policy. We don't make suggestions that this should be done and this has to be done. When asked, we will give our information, we'll give our assessments, that's it. It is the Pakistan ISI which provides its country strategic weightage in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is like a clandestine corps of the Pakistan army. So we have to accept these things when we talking of peace and prosperity and peace and tranquility with Pakistan. I think I would have covered everything. Have I missed out something?
No, I think you've been very forthright and said it as it is without beating around the bushes at all. Let me come to Mr. Menon on the issue of the criticism that intelligence agencies sometimes face, whether that's justified or not. The book makes a reference to 9/11, where then CIA Director George Tenet claimed later that he had in fact put up reports of a very significant terrorist attack, which then NSA Rice perhaps overlooked. So the question is, there must be literally overload of information coming to an NSA, whether it's an Indian NSA or an American NSA from intelligence agencies. How do you differentiate the signal from the noise, and what should we do in India to ensure that these things don't happen, where catastrophic incidents are warned but no action is taken?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the easiest thing when something goes wrong or something unexpected happens to say intelligence failure, they didn't tell us. But in most such cases you will find, whether it was 1962 or, as I think Vikram shows in the book, Kargil, the intelligence was available. It's just that it wasn't analyzed, it wasn't used, and nobody who should have looked at it looked at it. Even the US failures in 74 and 98 for Pokhran, both times, they had the data. It's just that it never reached the right people and was never analyzed or put up right. But the easiest thing is to blame the intelligence agencies because they have no way of defending themselves in public. They can't get into a public argument, and they have no way of defending themselves. So this is what all bureaucracies do. Please read what Vikram's written about Kargil. because it's worth reading. The real problem is it shouldn't either, neither should the whole system depend on some NSA's individual brilliance. No country like India or the US or no reasonable country can actually function on that basis. There has to be a system of analysis, of sifting, of then seeing which bits are important, which ones are leading somewhere. And those internal systems is what Vikram has actually written about here. And that's the most important part. That's the hardest part to get right. I cannot think of one system which has actually done it perfectly. Not the Russians, not the Americans, not anybody. Not the Chinese, not us. Certainly all of us have. But I think it's the ideal that you work for, and that you try and create a system where you're not dependent on either one NSA managing to sift through everything, or you try and build a system where what comes from the intelligence agencies, including the analysis, is then sifted and actually comes up to the top. Now, political leaderships, vary in quality, in attitude, but I don't think we have been lucky, I think, in India. We've never had a political leadership who doesn't actually consume the intelligence that reaches them. The trouble is they don't understand the process of how it's done. And that's why a book like Vikram's is important. Because increasingly, over time, today, we are in a polity where people are professional politicians. That's their experience, not life outside. So they don't come with a sense of how these things work. And therefore, it's important that we actually teach the establishment, government, how intelligence is gathered, how it works, and how to judge it, how to use it. That's not something that we've done very consciously before, but I think it's starting now. And this book does a great deal to do that.
Let me come to Mr. Sibal on the issue of the political leadership's grasp of these matters. Now, Mr. Sood talks about external intelligence, espionage, and covert operations being a country's first line of offense and defense. And he also mentions that we've been lucky to have prime ministers from Indira Gandhi to Atal Bihari Vajpayee who instinctively grasped the realpolitik nature of intelligence and used it to the nation's advantage. But he also cites an example where you've had idealists. You had Morarji Desai, whom he cites, who was a Gandhian, who apparently mentioned to Pakistan's General Zia-ul Haq that India was aware of Pakistan's development of nuclear capability, and that might have actually caused them to speed up that work. Having engaged with these issues in your career, Mr. Sibal, how do you think this impacts us? Because we are a very large and diverse and very contentious democracy. We see how our parliament functions. How do we ensure that the leadership that comes to take decisions on the intelligence agencies' reports is more clued into the realpolitik of the external world versus the realpolitik that we all deal with internally?
Well, this is the question you should have asked Shiv Shankar rather than me. I don't for a moment believe, leave aside Morarji Desai and his quirkiness, I don't think that the present leadership or those who preceded the present leadership did not pay attention to serious intelligence reports. It's part of policy making. And there's a great deal of reliance in the case of certain countries, especially our neighbors, on the inputs that we receive from R&AW. I would even go a little further and say that at least when I was in office, there was this perception that there was too much of a role that R&AW was playing in our relations with specific neighboring countries. And see, the thing is, in practical terms, that when an information comes through an intelligence source, or if it comes through our embassy or an external affairs source, the intelligence source always gets more play. because somehow the feeling is that they have really got hold of top secret conversations, top secret intercepts, top secret documents, and what they have presented is actually what is happening on the ground. And the same thing comes from the external affairs sources or others. It is part of general diplomatic work and this and that. So I have seen this in the case of some of our neighbors. I don't know what Shiv Shankar's experience.
Top secret.
So, but having said that, and having sat in on meetings where we've discussed intelligence reports and this and that, I think that Raw's inputs are important, vital, and they have much more liberty on the ground in doing things, in making contacts, in getting hold of information that normal diplomats would be able to do. And it gets reflected in policy making through the NSA or institutions higher than that. And now we have the National Security Council Secretariat, which is there, and there are other intelligence organizations. It's not only R&AW, there are others, very significant ones, which are playing a role. There might be a problem of, as it happens in the United States and elsewhere, of making sure that everybody works in the same direction. There is no conflict or competition in terms of turf and everything else. Or one intelligence agency wants to show that it is more efficient and therefore gets hold of some information and projects it, which might actually may or may not be entirely valid. So this sort of a thing also happens. But to answer your question more specifically, it would be a terrible dereliction of duty. And I don't think any leadership would be guilty of that if they disregarded what is evidently solid intelligence reports and not include that in part of taking policy decisions. I might also say that, when it comes to certain very important decisions, what is purely intelligence information, what is purely is information coming from other sources, what is the thinking around that. You see, you can't rely only on an intelligence report to take very, very important national decisions. They can help you in clarifying one aspect of a larger problem, of a larger issue in a larger decision-making process, but you can't simply base your very critical decisions simply on an intelligence report. So I think we should, with regard to oversight, we don't have the American system. And I don't think we have that kind of discipline even within our parliament that we can actually subject our intelligence agencies to parliamentary oversight and then not expect things to leak or become playthings in terms of political competition between parties and this and that and that. So I think we have to evolve to a higher and more efficient way of functioning before we take steps to emulate what some advanced, developed countries, which have a lot of experience in dealing with geopolitics and international relations, do at the present.
And I think that's the perfect segue to a question I've been meaning to ask Mr. Joshi about oversight. Now, in the UK, you have the agencies reporting to both the Home and the Foreign Secretaries, but also having direct access to the Prime Minister. Other countries like Germany and others and the US have some degree of parliamentary oversight. I must point out that I no longer have any conflict of interest on this issue, having just resigned from Parliament. So my question to Mr. Joshi is, you just heard Mr. Sibal say that India is not ready to have that kind of oversight. Your comments on this and what is the future of holding our agencies accountable, at least internally, to the government?
Thanks. This actually is an extremely vexed question. Intelligence agencies function in a very competitive environment, and the competition is with not just between different agencies within the country. The real competition is between actors outside, which is okay. In this case, ISI or someone else, who are constantly knocking at the doors, doing something or the other. Now, how do you put in place? I completely agree with you that there are parts of this book which I found not reassuring. I found them extremely disturbing. I found them extremely thought-provoking when you go into the nitty-gritties of how the world of intelligence operates. For example, in spite of oversight by the Congress in the US, what did 9/11 do? And what did the subsequent Iraq war do? And this is all written here in the book, if you read this book. It led to the corporatization of intelligence, the outsourcing of intelligence in a myriad ways. You many times have ended up creating a situation where actors, and especially when you have a revolving door policy, when people in the intelligence agency can then move out, join the corporates, which then supply intelligence, whether it is on WMDs, whether it is something else. Now you are building a very, very strong vested interest in the perpetuation of calamity, in the perpetuation of insecurity. And this has happened time and time again. For that reason, yes, there must be some oversight. But what kind of oversight mechanism is going to be effective? I do not think any place in the world, including the United States of America, including the British system, has really arrived at a solid basis of how this oversight should be actually exercised. So that is the first thing. The second thing is, we are heading into a world where you have a plethora of information, a surfeit of information. It is bombarding you from all sides. Everything is an intelligence source. There is so much activity taking place in the social media, in the cyber domain, which all becomes point of intelligence. In this sudden flood of information, what is credible information? What is non-credible information? What is actionable information? What is actionable intelligence, ultimately? Becomes extremely difficult. Many times you have situations where there is a flood of information, flood of intelligence reports coming in on various aspects. And only in hindsight does it become evident. Hindsight vision, as Mr. Sood has written very well in the book, is 2020. In hindsight, the dots connect. You say, oh, this was already there. Why was action not taken on this? So one part is oversight of intelligence agencies. The other part is oversight of the consumers of this intelligence. That oversight is also extremely important. Somewhere, if you talk of oversight, it is not just oversight of intelligence agencies. It is oversight also of the consumers of intelligence, the policymakers. Whether there was credible intelligence, whether the intelligence community gave the right intelligence at the right time, or were just bombarding with the surfeit of security threats, which were too numerous to be acted upon, which completely confused the policymaker at a particular point of time. So there are all these kinds of aspects to it, which become extremely important when we move into the new world where we are handling this. I do not have any answers. I do not have any straight answers. I don't think it's a process which is going to take time.
Before I open up to the audience for questions, I'm afraid I can't let this opportunity go by without putting my friend on the spot. And my question to you is this. I mentioned earlier about the threat that the book talks about in terms of social media, but every threat also has opportunities. I remember many years ago, during a visit to a foreign country, we were pointed out that the old days of espionage, where agents had to work very hard to bug a room or to tap into somebody's conversation, was all passé, because we ourselves, are carrying around the means of being bugged and being tracked. Now, similarly, in this whole arena of intelligence gathering and how it impacts governance, there must be opportunities from the point of view of somebody who serves at a high level in government, as you do. What do you think there could be?
Okay. Since I am still a parliamentarian, In defense of the Indian parliamentary system, I have to say one thing about oversight committees. To quote Vikram Sood, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. Without naming the country, we are talking about oversight committees and how they can bring about a balance in the functionality of agencies. One has to consider, and it's available publicly for viewing on instruments like YouTube, where Senate oversight committees are misled without full disclosure by intelligence agencies because they deem it not fit for even the oversight committee to have a full public view of either the source or the full material that they have at their disposal. They do so and they claim later that they do so hesitatingly. Hence, to presume that, as adding to Mr. Menon's proclamation here, that no system that you can study in the world has been perfect. And because intelligence is a human experience, you can never be assured of 100% safe or 100% correct methodology of approach. Insofar as opportunities are concerned, I think in my opening remarks I spoke about the cybersecurity industry, which is poised to flourish with a $300 billion projection till the year 2023. Now, when you talk about, and even today in this August gathering, when you talk about cybersecurity and you look at international conferences, you see people below the age of 30 gather together. We call them hackers, but now there is a new adjective added to it, ethical hackers. They tell you how your devices, the Internet of Things, is poised to fail and crash around you. When you look at cybersecurity only from an intelligence perspective or from a data gathering perspective, you limit the assumption of attack that can be mounted on your systems. For instance, in a particular cybersecurity conference where 25-year-olds had a face-off of speedy hacking, and speedy hacking into systems where, let's presume, ex-intelligence officer has to log into their own systems, that 25-year-old knew exactly the password. Now, imagine that is the world that we are living in today. There is a competition called Capture the Flag competition, which is a prototype of a city built and an invitation to any 20, 30-year-old to come and hack into that system. What does that system entail? It entails banking. It entails the energy stations in that particular city that has been put up to be hacked. And the assurance is that if you can hack this city, this 20-year-old or 30-year-old can do the same in the outside world. Which means they can turn off the lights, they can turn off your water, they need not disable only your telephone. So those are the realities that we live in. And how does an Indian startup convert it into an opportunity is where I feel the future lies. So when we talk about, let's say, a Prime Minister's concept of digital India, you are preparing a generation not only to become consumers, but also a generation that is fascinated with coding, also a generation which is smarter about using technology, a generation which is aware of how much technology can be used or how privacy and ethical issues need to be debated and deliberated upon. But it is also, I think, suffice to say, an opportunities where we have seen in nations where youngsters serve in an army, then go ahead, serve in the intelligence community, then come out, become entrepreneurs, and then their startup ventures start servicing the agency that they have just served and come out of. So it's an ecosystem that many countries currently live in. It is an ecosystem possibly one day which will emerge in our country as well, but that is the future of Internet of Things in terms of cybersecurity in our country. It is not about turning your phone into a microphone. People presume that, and again, I don't want to get into trouble, go Google IMSI catcher. But people presume that surveillance is about catching you talking to somebody for a particular length of time. But today, a 20-year-old something knows how to turn your own phone into a microphone. So when you look at an officer or when you look at somebody serving, they are bound by those ethics of functionality. The challenge is those who operate without that ethics outside the ambit of that cover of either governance or outside the ambit of that ethics. That is where the challenge is. But the opportunity is that whenever cybersecurity, or for that matter, whenever technology presents a challenge, there is somewhere somebody who's already ready with the solution. The idea is to connect that dot, and the idea is to help that get turned into an enterprise.
I was hoping for more trouble than that, but
If you need trouble, I know there are journalists in the house. There is not even half, but 1.5 page on journalist and the spy, which I'm promised by Mr. Sood can be one of the next books that he writes.
We'll take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Are there microphones available?
Yes.
Yes. I'll bunch up the questions and I'll direct them to panelists unless you have a specific panelist in mind. Shall we go here? Gentleman here. Microphone. And may I request you to keep it brief, please?
First of all, I would like to congratulate Mr. Sood for writing this book, and I think this book is going to bring the real world of intelligence in front of common people. I have 2 questions to the panelists. One relates to the role of intelligence organizations in policy formulation and policy implementation both. And the second question relates to oversight. Now, as Mr. Sood had mentioned, that intelligence agency is basically a service provider. More than that, we can also say that on critical national issues, after collecting information on those issues and analyzing it properly, they also come out with certain recommendations before the government or before the consumers for their consideration. At least it starts those recommendations may be accepted or not accepted, but it starts people to think about those issues. Now, as we all know that intelligence operations are basically,
Please come to the questions.
Basically covert operations. And my question is that in the foreign policy implementation, something needs to be done overtly, something needs to be done covertly. Do you think, my question is for the 2 ambassadors, do you think that somehow we have mixed up between the 2 as far as our neighbors are concerned? Because things which need to be done strictly covertly, many times are done in a overt manner without being careful about.
Thank you.
That has created a problem.
Thank you. So those 2 questions will come back to the panel in a moment.
And second question is about oversight.
No.
Oversight, the thing is that you have said that parliamentary oversight may not be possible here. There is no oversight in USA. USA also, after 9/11, they had set up a committee which created...
What's the question, sir?
So I'm just coming out to... which created the post of Director National Intelligence. So if the parliament oversight is not possible here for the time being, shouldn't there be some administrative oversight? Because there are 8 to 10 intelligence organizations where some sort of coordination and, oversight may be required.
Thank you. Now we'll take, there's a question there at the back. I'll bunch them together and come back to you.
Vikram, are you being too modest when you say that the R&AW is a service provider? Doesn't it have an aspiration, especially in the neighborhood, of being a true player?
Ambassador Katju gets to the heart. May we just come back so that we can keep to time because we're running out of time? At the very back, please.
I've known you, Mr. Sood, for 20 years now. Thank you when I received some tips here and there and helped me build up Calling Sehmat, which now became Razi. Everybody Loves the Drought was written by Sainath. And the fact is that everybody loves terror. It seems that we spend 8,000 crore every year in Valley. Everybody seems to know how to go across and get married to each other, except our intelligence. The problem is that as I was researching, writing, Calling Sehmat, that we are we are keeping our eyes very clean, open, or we are just simply not bothered. Is there a reason intelligence failure, or we are responsible for everything and accountable for none?
Let's take the answers from the panelists on this one. I'll first ask Mr. Menon to respond. Then Mr. Sibel, I think there was one question directed at him, and then Mr. Sood.
Well, on policy formulation and the role of, I think in practice it's true. They're not just a service provider, obviously, by the selection of intelligence, by what they suggest. And obviously, if policymakers ask them, what do you think we should do? I mean, they're part of the policy-making process. They are in the room. They are the ones who bring information. But I don't think you can draw a distinction between, oh, here's pure intelligence and here's pure diplomatic information. And that's not ever how it works in practice. And the key is to make sure that you're both doing the same things and that you're coordinated across the board. It's very hard to do, especially in the neighborhood. I mean, Nepal's a perfect example. Everybody is in Nepal. And everybody seems to run a different line on Nepal. In India, if you ask, everybody has an opinion. Pakistan, everybody is a Pakistan expert also. So everybody will tell you exactly what we should be doing. But the fact is that unless somebody in government, and the reason we set up an NSCS, an NSA, changed the whole system after Kargil, was precisely this, in order to try and bring it all together and to make sure that you had a coordinated approach, that you talk to each other. And I think that is a much better problem. I think this is artificial. This idea that, oh, you know, the diplomats do one thing, the intelligence people do something else. Neither can live without the other. And not just in terms of providing cover and so on. I think it's much more than that. On oversight, my own feeling is that the trouble is external agencies are basically illegal. What they're doing abroad is illegal. Let's face it, under the law of the land, and those countries are sovereign. So I'm not sure that you can construct a legal oversight mechanism which works very well there, except something internally, administratively, because it's a closed shop. Yes, it's a problem, but that can be done. But for domestic agencies, I think there is room for much more discussion among ourselves of how we can structure something that works in the Indian, especially for domestic enforcement agencies and so on, because many of those are now shading into intelligence agencies. This distinction between, you know, enforcement and actual pure intelligence, I think, is no longer true on the domestic side. And that's something that I think we need to have a discussion about. And the fact is, they are a true player in the neighborhood. But of course, they will never admit it, and it's a measure of their success that people think they're not. But if you listen to the Pakistani media or the ISI, they run Pakistan.
Mr. Sibel, there was a question to you about whether we mix up our overt and covert actions. Now, your line of work is what we should be doing overtly, I suppose. But the covert operations, do we mix it up sometimes?
I think there's no way that this can be mixed up in the manner in which the question has been posed, in the sense that there's confusion or the lack of understanding that certain things should actually remain covert and should be in a different box and should not be in the knowledge of everyone, and only very select people should know this. As was rightly said, the coordination between what you might call diplomatic inputs and intelligence inputs is done in the NSA's office and in the National Security Council Secretariat. And when it comes to certain covert operations, I mean, these are very tightly held as a secret, and Prime Minister's clearance would have to be obtained, and the Foreign Minister may know. Foreign Secretary may or may not know. Sometimes he knows, sometimes he may not know, depending on the nature of the covert operation. The army brass, if the military is involved, would know. But I think the covert part is a preserve of the intelligence agency. And while the Ministry of External Affairs is kept informed in terms of general intelligence inputs. But an actual operation is not something which is routinely shared with the Ministry of External Affairs when it comes to the Cabinet Committee on Security or some limited discussion with the NSA and the intelligence chiefs and the Foreign Secretary. He may become privy to something. But I don't understand the sense of the question. I think we are very clear in our mind that...
I think perhaps what he meant is do sometimes our covert operations work at cross purposes with what the diplomatic corps does.
No, this means that the intelligence agencies are working without authorization. Okay. And they are on their own. And they are doing things which are not approved. No, I don't think that within our system there are intelligence chiefs who have that kind of self-confidence that they can do things
and that,
on their own.
And that brings us to the perfect conclusion where we end with the author. I'm afraid we won't have time to go back to the audience for questions. There were two zingers shot at you by, I would imagine, old friends.
Yeah,
so although the former NSA did try to give you some covering fire, I think you will have to answer the question, did you not aspire to be a real player? And the other question also.
No, we all have our ambitions. But the point is, there is a certain, there is a narrow definition. What is covert is not my business. What is covert, have I said the right way?
You said
what is overt is not is primarily the open diplomacy. Covert is my business. But covert will not happen at variance with the open. There will be, it is another thing, as Kamal said, that sometimes the Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Minister may not know, but usually they know that there is a certain operation on, and that's where it ends. That's where nobody below that gets to know anywhere else. In my book, I have said that we are essentially a service provider, but I did not want to include too much about the covert section. So I said with a covert option. See, I don't want to talk about the R&AW as only a gunslinging special op covert setup. We do classical intelligence. And we hope we do it well. And my colleagues, my former colleagues and friends have mentioned that they do regard the intelligence inputs with some seriousness.
There's a couple of things which are relevant to this which I'd like to mention. Yeah. One is that when I was a member of the National Security Advisory Board, where of course then you can let your hair down and say all sorts of things which you will not say when you're sitting in the chair, that if there are some problems, then why don't you get rid of them? When I say get rid of them, you may understand what I mean. And one person who's been in this trade and has held the top position said that my charter does not allow it. There are no laws in this country which will give me protection if such a decision was taken. First of all, there has to be a law. So that is an issue in terms of what you might call, what the Israelis do quite frequently when they want to get rid of troublesome people. So I think in a democratic country like ours, there is this issue. And the second thing is that many people think that no Prime Minister of India can give instructions of this nature. Or for that matter, I don't know if the American president does it, probably he does it. The French president does. Sarkozy, no, Hollande in his book, he's mentioned this, where he gave orders for political assassinations, etc., etc. But I think in our system, I don't think we have reached that level of realpolitik, where such decisions can be taken and assumed by the political authority. And lastly, in terms of covert operation, an oversight. The CIA, for example, became and is a power unto itself, and has, in effect, a foreign policy of its own, which works very frequently contrary, sometimes to the administration policies, and we've seen this in the case of our own of their policy towards Pakistan, for instance. Because of all the scandals associated with the CIA, the Iran-Contra scandal, this and that, there has been a lot of demand in the United States at the political level to curb the power of the CIA, and today you see what's happening under Trump. I think we haven't reached that kind of situation in India where there would be a legitimacy in this demand that there must be oversight.
Thank you. And with that, we must come to a close for this session. It's been a wonderful panel. We've had a wonderful audience. Thank you. Do read the book.
Thank you so much.